Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm just letting a few more participants join us here this moment. Let me get a couple things. I see some raised hands. Welcome. Any questions before we get started? All right. All right. I see a few of us joining. I'm going to just let that roll on in. And we'll begin in just a moment. So as you're getting started, as you're getting set up, I appreciate your time. All right. All right. Well, I'm going to begin. Again, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Odette Falone. I am Inspired Instruction's Director of Products and Services, and I'm very happy to be here today to speak to you about maximizing the impact of PLCs and discussing some strategies for collaborative growth and data-driven success. We have a very robust webinar for you today, full of valuable information and some great tools and resources that I'm very excited to share with you. And please be advised that as I am displaying resources and sharing some of these great pieces of downloadable content that you could use, all of that will be shared with you at the conclusion of today's webinar via email. So you'll be able to access and download any of the items that I share with you today. And hopefully you'll be able to turn and use them, as soon as your heart desires. I'm also going to be sharing my email address at the end of today's session for any questions that might be lingering. Please feel free to use me as a resource and touch base if you have any questions that arise based on PLCs or otherwise. So let's get started. All right, so our agenda this afternoon consists of 4 parts. We are going to start with just a quick PLC overview. We'll define the term and discuss some of the common obstacles that come along with planning and implementing PLCs in your schools. Secondly, we will begin to dive into a little bit about what it means to create a PLC purpose. This really helps with how we can keep teachers' eyes on the prize and focus and motivated on what the goals are of your professional learning communities in your building, and helping them see that success that we're expecting. Third, we'll dive into developing a data-driven culture. So we'll talk about how we can use data as a roadmap, as a guideline to make instructional decisions, and ultimately improve student outcomes. And finally, our heftiest piece of today's webinar will spend some time discussing how to structure PLCs for success. So I have some great templates, some resources and tools that you can implement into your PLC practice. And again, guide your staff, guide your teachers through the process of professional learning community from start to finish. Right. And again, please do remember that anything we share today will be sent to you after today's webinar. All right. So let's get started with topic 1, just a PLC overview and defining the term and discussing some of those common obstacles. So I am aware that, PLCs are a buzzword. PLC is a buzzword that has been around for quite some time now. So many of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with the term PLC. But for those of you that aren't, I have a quick, succinct definition that I like to use to help guide my thought process around what a PLC is and how we can, structure framework around that. So PLC stands for Professional Learning Community, and it's an ongoing process in which educators work collaboratively in recurring cycles of collective inquiry and action research to achieve better results for the students that they serve. I've bolded a couple of items there because I think it's very important to highlight the piece about collaboration and the piece about results for students. Those are 2 very big pieces of what makes up effective PLCs. And it's important to note that because, again, there are many pieces to the PLC puzzle. But that collaborative piece, the results vision, right, is very important. As well as some of the other pieces. That recurring cycle, we'll speak to that very often today, as well as that action component that we want to make sure we're accomplishing. But I want to highlight a quick myth about collaboration before I move on. Generally, people think that they love to collaborate. They love to be around other people and talk and discuss and share ideas and things like that. But it's very important to understand what collaboration really means in order to understand what a professional learning community is. Because collaboration is really, it's a difficult task to accomplish and do well. It requires time, it requires practice, it requires accountability. And as a leader of a school, if you're really looking to develop a collaborative culture within your district, within your building, within your PLCs, you really need to understand that it's not just giving staff time to work together, right? That time is not always going to be spent in a successful way. So in order to be successful, we want those collaborative meetings to be focused. That's a very important word here in that collaborative definition. Focused, and there needs to be results, right? It needs to result in action. So this really takes time, and it takes persistence, and it takes coaching to achieve true collaboration in its truest form. And that is a very vital part of what PLCs are. Okay. So now that we've kind of spoken to the definition a little bit more, I want you to think about what an effective PLC looks like. What would you like to see happening in your schools? If you walked in on a PLC meeting, what would you want to be hearing? What would you want to see? What kind of, dialogue might you be listening for? Feel free to enter some responses in the chat, just a quick sentence or two, or just a few adjectives or nouns that will help kind of frame your thinking about what an effective PLC looks like. And I'll speak to a couple of those responses in a moment. Okay. So if you've been thinking about that for a moment, I just want you to continue to, consider what would that look like? What might that look like? You might be thinking or considering things like discussion. There might be focus. You might be seeing data being utilized and analyzed. You might note that there's engagement, problem solving happening. You might hear feedback being shared. All those things are great items that you might be already considering. And it's, again, not an all-inclusive list whatsoever. But if a PLC is done well, a consistent and effective use of a PLC can bring about many, many different things. So there's a lot of research out there that shows that PLCs, when done effectively, contribute to a positive school climate. It also can improve many other items that I'll list for you here. It can improve communication skills within staff. It can provide teachers with other viewpoints and perspectives. This is a huge, valuable thing that PLCs can do for you and for your staff and for your district. There is a consultant on our staff that is just tremendous. And one of her, most famous sayings is that your best resource is right down the hall. And that's something very important for teachers and, and specialists and staff to understand, is that the community within which you work, there's so much value, a wealth of knowledge there. So making that part of what a PLC is very important. Understanding that viewpoints, strategies, resources that other teachers are using can be brought into your classroom as well, and can open your eyes to new things. It can also promote educational risk-taking, which is linked with what we were just sharing. If you see that something looks interesting and fun, but might be a little bit scary to try, as a teacher, if you see it's working for someone else, it might prompt you to try that and take a risk and attempt that strategy as well. They also can build interpersonal trust, improve conflict resolution skills. Again, it's never to say that, there's not going to be conflict in PLCs. Whenever you have a room full of different personalities, it's possible that there's opportunity for conflict, but it's a good thing if it's in this type of structure where there are opinions and there are discussions happening in a productive way. They can streamline student learning. PLCs can pull teachers out of their silos and really get them all on the same page. And that leads to increased student achievement. It can also provide support in a sometimes isolating profession. So it allows teachers to recognize that there is a network there of others to support them. And finally, it can start to build that excitement and passion about teaching and learning. If done effectively, PLCs really can start to develop that realization of, yes, this is why I'm a teacher. These are the reasons why to impact the education of these students and to see that growth and progress happening. And these meetings can lead to that. So again, research-backed strategies and not an all-inclusive list, but a great list nonetheless. Okay. So now that we've gone through some of the benefits of what a PLC can, can bring about, it's also important to draw the line and focus on, again, student learning, on results, and on progress, and think about what PLCs should not be used for and what they may be used for, because there really is a difference between the two. We want to keep PLCs what they are, professional learning communities, which are focused on those results and those actions that we talked about earlier, and not just a time that teachers are together that can be used for anything, because that's when you really start to lose the value of what PLCs are. So what we want to stay away from using PLC time for, we don't want to use it for trainings that can occur during faculty meetings. We don't want to use them for planning field trips or grading papers, or even for meeting about individual student behaviors. Those are all things that should remain out of PLCs, but they may be used for a lot. Professional development, that's job embedded, closely aligned with the essential outcomes that they're working on. They may be used for development of common assessments, analysis of the data of those common assessments or formative assessments. It can be used for planning of differentiated instruction lessons. And the list could go on, but these are just some, high-level things that PLCs can be used for in an effective setting. Just again, reiterating that giving teachers time doesn't mean an effective PLC is taking place, but giving teachers a focus while they're using that time can. All right, so I wanted to share this quote as well, that, I implemented this here. It's just a quote that I love, and I think it's got a lot of great things going on in it. Rick DeFore said this. He is a PLC guru, but I'll read to you, what the statement is, and I'll kind of describe why I find it to be such a valuable quote. So talking is not doing. Planning is not doing. Goal setting is not doing. Training is not doing. Even directing resources to support a plan is not doing. It's not until people are doing differently that any organization can expect different results. So again, this really hits home for me when thinking about PLCs, because a lot of these things happen in PLCs: talking, planning, goal setting, resource direction, all of that, and they're good things. But not until people are doing differently can you really expect to see those results that we're hoping for with all of those other actions, right? So just again, remembering that PLCs, they're not just another program that we're trying to implement in Teachers Day. They're really how we operate collectively and how we ensure that all students are achieving success. So really thinking to yourself that if we are improving and changing and doing, students will improve along with that. And they're very directly related, and it's important to remember that. Okay. All right, so we may feel, and we've been hearing from many, many districts that we've been working with, that a common theme among schools is that, teachers are not feeling engaged or motivated when they're working in PLCs. A lot of times, school leaders are seeing that this time is being used as a gripe session or a venting session for, things that they are worrying about or stressed about, understandably. And they may even hear things like, why am I here when I have 1,000 things to do? Valid. Okay. So it's something that we want to kind of attack head on, just as teachers want to address the misconceptions that their students have in the classroom to effectively teach to that. We want to address these misconceptions and tackle these obstacles head on before we start our PLCs, because again, that will kind of clear the air and open the door up for maybe a more open-minded view about what PLCs can do and how they are very valuable in a school community. So think about to yourself, what are some of the obstacles that you're facing? What are teachers saying about PLCs in your school? I'm going to share a few different examples of things that we hear frequently, trends that we're seeing. And they might match up with what you're hearing and seeing. And, some of the strategies and information might be able to support how you respond to some of this dialogue. So one thing, and this is a very common, if not the most common, piece that we hear from teachers and administrators is that we don't have time. PLCs don't fit in the day. We don't have time to fit it in. It's too hard to provide the necessary hours. But it's important to remember that hundreds, thousands of schools are making it happen. Okay, so you just need to get creative. Maybe think about some schools have late start mornings that students start a little bit later. Maybe they're starting the day with their special, and then teachers are getting, a chance to meet with their groups before students, arrive for their class. Others rework their schedules to create that planning time, just as you might believe in your personal life. If you really care about something, you make time for it. The same goes for this. If you really truly believe in the value of what PLCs can do, you can make time for it. Get creative, ask your teachers for help. If you want to do it, you'll find a way. Even again, thinking collaboratively about how this could fit into your day and get their input. And that really shows how much you value the work that can be done. Another piece is that PLCs won't make a difference. So it's clear that if, staff or teachers are not given the support they need, especially in the beginning, they're going to feel this way. They're not going to learn how to work collaboratively. They're going to feel that there's, really 1,000 other things to do that are more important to them than what a PLC might be able to do to their day. But really, again, those effective PLCs apply strategies that are going to lead to the growth and lead to improved student learning. And if teachers start to see that change, they're going to get the buy-in, right? So you need to model it. You need to give the support that they need at the beginning, and in order to be able to collaborate, to structure a PLC, and they're going to start to see those results. The third piece is we don't know how to do them correctly. So again, a valid point. If this is something that teachers are experiencing and they feel like they don't really even know where to begin when it comes to working in a PLC, of course the time is not going to be spent appropriately. Now, there's really no one right way to do or to set up a PLC. But really, what's going to work for you and your building and your school is that there are clear expectations set up. So work together with your staff, with your groups, and figure out what those details are, what those expectations and procedures are. And I'm going to share a lot with you this afternoon that will help support some of those processes and clear up some of those obstacles before they start to occur. Okay. So again, before we continue to move on, I want to just share a couple of, a little gentle reminder, in other words, that it's best practice for administrators to attend their team's PLCs or their, school's PLCs at least once a month or every so often. And really to attend it as a group member, not as a formal observer. And the reason behind that is there are many, many research-backed benefits to administrator involvement in PLCs. And I'm just going to list a few here, but really just keeping that in mind that it's best practice to be a part of it, to sit in the seats with your teachers and to have those collaborative discussions as a team member. And it can really do wonders for the effectiveness of the PLC, but also for many other things, such as open communication. It can improve school climate. It gives teachers and leaders a shared sense of leadership, right? Where these PLCs are being led by the group and you are a member of that group. But again, it keeps things in that shared sense. It improves interpersonal trust. It gives an increased feelings of support and increased teacher effectiveness, right? So again, keeping that in mind, that your presence in these meetings can not only, be supportive in those ways, but also can keep things on track, keep that focus going. And it also gives you that shared sense of leadership in this group. All right. So moving on to our second piece of our agenda this afternoon, we're going to talk a little bit about creating a PLC purpose. So we went through some of those common misconceptions or the myths of PLCs and some of the obstacles that we face when structuring them and implementing them. So we'll talk now about how we can keep teams motivated and keep them focused. I'll share with you today how we can create a PLC purpose for each group. Each professional learning community can have its own purpose. And all teachers and all members are involved in creating that purpose. Their involvement really plays a big part in their ownership of what they're doing. And it makes them accountable for the work that they're doing there, right? So, and it also can be a very fun experience to create this purpose statement. It's an engaging and exciting activity to be able to take part in. So in order to achieve that strong foundation in establishing PLCs, as I said, every group should create their own purpose statement. And this statement is the reason that the team exists in the first place. It describes the work that they're engaged in and how it's going to increase student learning. And it also really brings everybody together as one collective, effective team. So the activity I'm going to share with you is called GOILS activity. Not the best acronym to describe, but it stands for Groups of Increasingly Larger Size. And this template here, like I said, is going to be shared with you at the end of today. But this is what you would be able to use to guide this activity. So it would start off with everyone having this sheet of paper and thinking about this central question right here on the left. What is the purpose of this PLC, this particular one that we're in today? What is the purpose? And independently, each group member writes their response in the first box on their own. Once everyone has completed that, they find a buddy, and two individuals come together and look at their first response and combine their two responses to create combined response number 1. So they're taking input from both of the individuals and combining them to create a new purpose statement together. Now you have a whole bunch of groups of 2 now floating around your room. You're going to have a group of 2 find another group of 2, and they are going to combine their response number 1s to create a combined response number 2. And so on. So those groups of 4 now are floating around, or groups of 2 and 2 are floating around to find a group of 4. And they're going to combine their responses to create combined response number 3. And finally, your whole group is coming together to combine all of their response number 3s into one concise, succinct team purpose statement. So as you can see, this takes a little bit of time to go through, but it's extremely valuable in everybody playing a part in what the purpose statement is. It's a great way to start rolling out your PLCs by creating something like this. And at the end, it has inclusions of every single team member within that purpose statement. It could be something that you hang up on the wall, put on a piece of chart paper, and refer to it every single time you have a meeting. This is our purpose. This is the reason why we're here. This is what we're here to do. Okay. So to give some examples of some sample purpose statements, you might have the group decide that their purpose is to plan, share, and collaborate for student growth. It might be to better understand, their own students in academics and citizenship. This could be, these are 2 of an endless amount of possibilities of what a purpose statement can be, and they can be even more specific depending on the group that you're working with. But this, again, is the central purpose of what this PLC is meant to do. So from there, I just have quickly a simplified visual of what PLCs can look like. And we'll continue to hone in on each of these sections, as we've already started to a little bit, as we go throughout the remainder of the webinar. So again, just cycling through that collaboration, the focus on learning, the focus on results, and so on and so on. And that continuous movement through those pieces is what, brings together what a PLC could look like. Okay. So we're going to take some time now to discuss how we're going to develop that data-driven culture. So how are we going to use data to guide our instructional decisions? The data is your roadmap, right? It is what you want to use it's the map you want to use to be able to make instructional decisions. It's how you want to, plan and target instruction and all of that, and essentially improve student outcomes. So it's a very valuable component of what PLCs can action, and using that information is a very valuable tool. So to start, I'm sharing just this very common challenge that schools face, and I see this all the time. We hear it very frequently, that schools are data rich and information poor. So what exactly does that mean? There is data coming out their ears a lot of times in schools. Teachers feel that way, that they have common assessment data, formative assessment data, they have tests, quizzes, they have unit tests, they have state assessments, high stakes tests, lots of different things, numbers, platforms, tons of information coming their way. Tons of data coming their way, but the information that they're pulling from that data is not always there, right? And it almost feels like there's too much. There's a mountain to climb, and they're not sure where to begin. So how can we move towards making sure that our building is collecting, assessing, analyzing, and acting on this data in a meaningful way? That acting on component is really the part I'm trying to drive home here. In order to drive that school improvement and ultimately the student achievement, we need to create the conditions where the data's data-driven school culture can just thrive, right? So we want to make it as easy and efficient as possible for your teachers and for your staff to be able to identify the data they want to use, identify where students are struggling, examine what the root cause is, and of the challenges they're having, and then determine what the best actions are. So having said all that, I'm going to go through some different steps that you can take to move towards that direction and start to pull some of the rich amount of data that you have and use it for good. So how can we be data champions? I like to think of data as a map. I mentioned that before. So teaching without data is like teaching without a map, right? And, a lot of our teachers and staff may not really understand the significance of what data can, the value that data has. So in order to get that buy-in for using it and developing that data-driven culture that we all want, we have to really model and demonstrate why data is so important. Why does it matter so much? There's just so many things going on and so many things on teachers' plates and on their shoulders. Why does data have to be one that's at the top of their priority list? So one way to kind of describe it and to think about, data collection and data analysis at your school, sort of as if you were traveling to a destination with, let's say, Google Maps or, Waze. And let's say you're driving along using Google Maps to get to where you want to go, and accidentally you miss your exit, let's say. What happens then? Your Google Maps or your Waze or whatever you like to use, your app of choice, it reroutes you, it redirects you, it recalibrates, right? So it has new information now of what your current location is, and it's quickly giving you a revised plan of how to get you where you need to be or where you want to go. So it's really very similar to describe how student performance data is used to inform instruction, right? So at the beginning of the year, you're paying very close attention to the standards, you're paying close attention to those, benchmark assessments that students take and the data that comes in through that. And really, you need to just continue to keep checking in and analyzing and creating a plan to adjust course should your students not be achieving mastery and getting to where you'd like them to be or where they need to be, right? So just like traveling with your Google Maps or your Waze or anything like that, there needs to be very thoughtful, intentional approach to get to your data destination, right? So that's where data-driven instruction cycle comes in, okay? So all of that to say, we can boil it down to 4 main points, and we can move through this cycle in a couple of different ways. And again, this cycle can be documented in some of the templates that I'm going to share with you soon. So the starting point would be the assessment, right? If we're thinking about that data-driven culture and the data-driven instruction cycle, we start with an assessment, something that we could use to gather and collect data. And this could be any kind of assessment. It could be your state assessment. It could be formative assessments, or it could be benchmarks or, common assessments or what have you. And from there, once that data is collected, we can start to analyze. And this is where you're making those informed decisions about what the data says, reading into it, reading between the lines, and thinking about how we can take action to improve student outcomes. So that's where the action comes in. So here you're actually implementing those pieces that you discussed during the analysis stage, targeting the instruction, being strategic about the changes you're making, and discussing those actions. And finally, the monitoring stage comes in. And this is where you and your team monitor together, you adjust, you make changes, you continue to recalibrate and make sure that you're meeting those learning goals. But really, the very most important piece of this cycle is that it continues to happen over and over again, many times throughout the year, performing these 4 steps over and over and continuing the cycle. And that's how that data-driven culture continues, that this becomes ingrained in the process of what teachers are doing and the meetings that teachers are having. These 4 steps continue to repeat over and over again. And as I said, I'm going to share a template with you here to start and a few others in a moment. But this is just a data analysis guide that can help guide the dialogue that staff is having about their data. It can be used for any subject, any grade level, any matter. But it's just some things that include some questions that you can use to help guide your conversations. Once you've collected the data and really taken a close look, this can help with that next step in the direct, data-driven instruction process. So in this template, you'll find some questions, things like, which students needed additional time? How will learning be enriched for students who are highly proficient? Where did my students struggle? Which strategies were used by my colleagues whose students perform well? So that's, again, a really important dialogue happening in PLCs. Okay, my students struggled with this, and this is what I was doing. Your students excelled with this. What were you doing? Let's see if we can implement something new, take a risk, and make a change. In what areas did the entire team's students struggle? And why do you believe that happened? And what's your plan for improvement? Again, so this is an informal sheet that just kind of helps guide the conversation through a dialogue about data. Okay, so again, that's just to support and assist in your dialogue or in your data journey in your PLCs. So I have here, a great tool that I will again share at the end of today's session, but this includes, a nice visual, but also a great cycle that shares 4 strategic questions to guide effective PLCs. Just as I shared with you that, data-driven instruction cycle, this aligns very closely with what I was just describing, but it dives a little bit deeper and provides some suggested discussion topics that, staff can go through. And what I mentioned before remains true for this. You want to repeat this cycle and move through it consistently over and over again and to guide your PLCs, and that will keep them focused on the learning, on the collaboration, and on the results. So in this visual here, you would start with that pink square. What are your anticipated outcomes for students? So here's where you want to talk about, okay, what are the power standards, the learning targets, whatever essential questions. These are the things that you want to be, using to drive your conversations in that first meeting, the first official, progress starter to guide your effective PLCs. From there, we're going to move to that yellow box. Okay, so now we have that conversation about the anticipated learning outcomes. How are you going to know if students have successfully achieved those outcomes, right? Are you going to use formative assessment, common assessment? How are you going to check for understanding? As a PLC, you can come together to discuss what are those things going to look like. Then you're going to move on to that green box. What actions will you take if students successfully attain the desired outcomes? So if you have a green light, yes, great. Our students understand what they need to understand. What exactly are you going to do then? Are you going to provide enrichment, differentiation, maybe some self-directed learning? What's going to happen there? And if they do not attain those desired outcomes, what happens then? Right? So we have maybe RTI, you're going to include differentiation there. Maybe you're going to use targeted small group instruction. And then you can continue the cycle again. So you monitor and you check and you repeat. Okay. So again, this is a nice way to something that can guide your instruction or guide your conversations rather in your PLCs in a way that kind of provides some additional support as you're going through and moving through that cycle. So if we're finally going to put all of the pieces together to show kind of a little timeline of what a PLC cycle could look like. Because those questions I just shared with you prior include, some great questions that can guide the conversations that happen in your PLCs. But if we take a step back, there might be some things that need to take place in between those meetings, right? So we start with that initial question of what the anticipated outcomes are for students. We know that. So once that's determined and answered, teachers in their PLCs or PLC members would work to create a SMART goal or an action plan or common assessment or all of those things. And I'll share some templates that you can use as well for this piece. But this is a great time for teachers to work backwards, right? Start with the end in mind. Let's think about the outcomes. Now, what is that going to look like in an assessment? Let's make this first so we know where to direct, how to target our teaching and, direct our instruction. Then we're going to implement strategies in the classroom. So from there, we teach, right? We check for progress. We use formative assessments. We continue to do those checks for understanding. Once we've done that, we check in with each other. Okay, now, how can we tell if students learned what we were trying to teach? Did they get it? And we give our common assessment and analyze the results or an assessment, right? At that stage to decide, was the information, did it go through? Then finally, what actions are we going to take if students attained them and if they did not attain them? So what are we thinking about how we're going to address if students were successful or if they struggled? And then from there, we say, okay, we're going to take those insights and turn them into action and start to implement some of those things and start the cycle again. Okay, so that has a little more clarity in between what might happen in between the stages of those 4 questions. But it gives, a nice little overview of how things would lay out in a timeline. Okay, so our final section of today's webinar, structuring PLCs for success. As I've been mentioning throughout, I have several really effective and useful tools that you can use to organize some of your PLCs and get things going between setting norms and creating those SMART goals and things like that to kind of get the groundwork laid and then begin, some of these effective PLCs. So just before we kind of dive into those things, just a quick overview of how to set the stage, right? We talked about this a little bit earlier, but we really want to empower educators to take the reins in their PLCs. It's not going to happen overnight, but if we're able to really set the stage, it will continue to build and improve as time goes on. So very important is setting that clear purpose. We talked about that earlier, and the priorities. So what is the reason behind why we're having this meeting each and every time? Providing them with access to resources that enable them to make those informed decisions. So what types of platforms do we have? What types of data analysis tools are teachers using? What types of data is being collected? So whatever teachers need, if there is a struggle to get that information, there's going to be a wall there that they're hitting, right? So we want to make sure that they have access to everything that's necessary in order to make those informed decisions. We want to engage them in establishing those clear benchmarks to monitor progress. So set those things on a calendar. When are these going to happen? When are they going to take place? What do they look like in their lesson plans? And ensuring that they have relevant and timely data. And finally, providing the training, support, and resources that lead to success. So some of these tools and resources that we share today could be a part of that, right? Resources that can help support them in these meetings, and training and support of their leaders and administrators and coaches being a part of these PLCs is very important. So some planning PLC planning questions. This is a great place to start with your PLC process. So this is before any PLCs have started. We want to start to think about how we can get them off the ground and do it right. So again, these are just some questions, not an all-inclusive list, but some great things to wrap your mind around and get some thinking on some of these items. You know, this is a list that was shared by the New Jersey Department of Education, but they are completely relevant for any and all states as they guide through the planning process. So the first question you might want to think about is, how does it make sense to organize teachers into teams at your school? There's no right way to do this. You might want to do it by grade level, by students taught, by content. It's really up to you what you think makes the most sense for your school and what you're trying to accomplish. You might think about which staff members might not fit into teams. So maybe you have specialists or special area teachers or support staff that you'd like to incorporate. How are you going to make that work so that they have a valuable experience as well? You'll want to think about what common time you have now, and if that time is flexible. And do your teachers participate in any other common meetings? And if so, how did you find time for those? So you can start to repeat that process to make time for PLCs. And finally, what does your collective bargaining agreement say about time at your school day? It's an important question. So what are the parameters that you'll need to work with, related to time? Definitely something you want to think about when creating, PLCs for your school. Okay, so the how and why about creating norms. I've mentioned earlier a couple of times how important it is to set clear expectations, to set guidelines for schools, for PLCs, rather. And norms are a very important part of that process. They can help clarify those expectations, they promote open dialogue, and they serve as a very valuable tool for holding people accountable, especially if all teachers are involved in creating them. So this template here that I will share includes a lot of questions within it, but it guides the process of creating those norms as a group, something that you can use during one of your first PLCs of the year. And it asks questions like, about time, when they're going to meet, how will the meeting begin and end? How are we going to encourage participants to actively listen to each other? What about confidentiality, decision-making, participation? What kinds of expectations will be involved? I've seen schools implement 5 minutes at the beginning of every PLC meeting for just venting. And they call it wine time, something like that. And it's part of their norms. They get it all out in the beginning. They need to, and then they turn it off and they move on to what they're there to do. And sometimes teachers need that. It's a very valuable thing to be able to, let out what they need to let out before they get caught up in it, and it takes away from the meeting time. So again, really, it's up to the group to create the norms how they see fit. But what's very important is that this is referred to each and every time there's a PLC meeting. You bring up these norms, review them, just as you would with, a class of students, to remind ourselves what it is that, that we're there to do and what's acceptable and what isn't. Okay. Another great template here is for SMART goals. So we mentioned earlier about creating goals within your PLCs. And these SMART goals are much easier to action. If you've not heard of SMART goals before, it's an acronym for specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. And I have a few other letters that I like to add into that acronym to it. I'll share in a moment. But this template will give participants a place to come up with the answers to these questions when they're creating their goals, to make sure that their goals really do hit all of these components and they have a clarity to them. So it's not just something like, oh, our goal is to improve reading comprehension. Okay, great. But how are you going to do it? How are you going to measure it? How are you, how long will it take? All of those things make it, again, much easier to action. So in this statement here, we see S for specific in SMART. Obviously, yes, we want goals to be specific, and we also want them to be strategic. So goals need to be straightforward and they need to be clearly written. M for measurable. How are you going to measure your progress? If we can't measure it, we can't manage it. Again, another important piece. A for attainable. I also like to say A for action oriented. So we want our goals to have active, not passive verbs, and we want to have the specificity of who's going to do what. Then we have relevant, R for relevant. We also want that R to stand for rigorous, realistic, and results focused, right? So we got 3 additional R's there. A goal is not an activity. It's a goal makes clear what's different, what will be different as a result of achieving that goal, right? And then finally, T for time bound. It can also be T for tracked. So a goal needs to have a deadline. The deadlines help us take action as we do with our students. That keeps us motivated, keeps us engaged in what we're doing. So all of those pieces are very important. So some sample goals could look like this year, at least 90% of our students will meet or exceed the targeted score of 3 on each strand of our summative writing prompt in May. So that's a great example of one that includes all of those specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound components. One that doesn't, students will improve their reading comprehension. Similar information, but as you can see, there is a very big difference between the two. A final template I'm going to share with you today is this PLC agenda planner. So PLCs work when they're productive, of course. Each meeting should end by creating the agenda for the next meeting. So remembering to kind of plan backwards, right? Or think about the future moments and start with the end in mind. That's something that I always live by. In this template, you can see clearly here, it just gives space for participants to list what they'll need, what the norms are, what their SMART goal is, and then document some strategies and who's responsible, what's the target date, and what the evidence is going to be to keep things on track and keeping them productive. So it provides that bit of accountability that we mentioned earlier and allows participants to really be accountable for it. It's a nice thing to have someone who may not be as excited about being a part of a PLC to be involved in keeping track of this agenda planner. It gives a nice responsibility and involvement in the work. And again, that ownership to what the goals are. So finally, I have just a few tips to, promote PLC acceptance, tips from me to you as we wrap up today's session. My first tip is to start slowly. Take baby steps. There's no way that you can expect perfect PLCs to happen overnight, right? So continue to check in on your staff, on your PLC groups, on your teachers, and have them reflect a little bit on what their strengths are so far in working with PLCs. Maybe think about what they need to improve and how they can start to do that. And, really moving at that slow pace, identifying a couple of different things you want to work on, and move slowly, because that's how you're going to see that continuous growth. Another tip is to integrate formal and informal collaboration. So something I mentioned earlier, just a few moments ago, if you have let's say a teacher or two that's a little bit reluctant to be an active member of a PLC, involving them in some of those documentation components or tracking components can be really beneficial to keep them involved. And it might lead to, further active involvement through other components. So that's something to think about. Third is to persevere. I know I said this before, but PLCs really take time to grow. They have their ups and downs, just like every professional group does. But to keep pushing forward and keep moving forward and keeping that purpose in mind of the students and the actions that we want to be able to accomplish. And finally, learn to let go. So once a PLC is really fully integrated into, a teacher's life, a teacher's work and school environment, you can start to let teachers leave these PLCs and, allow them to really start to foster the autonomy they need to be able to get those PLCs off the ground and flying and become their own. So that's my tips: to start slowly, integrate collaboration, persevere, and to learn to let go as I send you off at the end of today's session. But I thank you so much for your time and attention today. As I said I would earlier, my email address is odette.falone@inspiredinstruction.com. Please feel free to reach out if you have questions or anything you'd like to share. I also do have a feedback form of, an evaluation form that I'd love to be able to get your feedback on. I just popped that into the chat. So it's a quick Google form if you have a moment just to give us a little bit of feedback, as we are as a company continuously growing and learning every day. So I'd love to be able to hear from you there. Otherwise, thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate you being here. And I look forward to, hopefully working with you in the future. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much.